The morning of the St. Mary Mead summer picnic dawned with a kind of golden serenity that seemed almost suspiciously perfect. The lawns glistened faintly with dew, and the hedgerows bordering the village green were heavy with blossoms, pinks, whites, and purples, all trembling gently in the breeze. To the casual observer, it might have appeared that nothing unpleasant could ever disturb such an idyllic English scene. But as Miss Jane Marple often remarked, human nature has a way of spoiling even the best weather. By 10 o'clock, the green was alive with chatter and movement. Tables were being laid out beneath the oaks, gingham cloths fluttering like flags of domestic pride. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, had organized the event with her usual brisk efficiency. Every sandwich triangle aligned, every sponge cake accounted for. She moved about with a clipboard in hand and a slightly harried smile that betrayed both pride and fear of chaos. Children darted between the tables with shrieks of laughter, while their mothers pretended not to notice the grass stains accumulating on freshly laundered knees. The men, gathered in a loose circle near the lemonade tent, spoke loudly about cricket, the rising price of petrol, and, as always, the latest rumor regarding Colonel Harcourt's finances. Miss Marple sat quietly beneath the elm, her knitting basket by her side and a delicate china cup in hand. She was not officially part of the organizing committee. She had tactfully declined Mrs. Weatherby's invitation, but no village event ever escaped her quiet attention. She watched the crowd with the mild, bird-like interest that made people underestimate her. Every greeting, every sidelong glance, every overly bright laugh was catalogued somewhere behind those deceptively gentle blue eyes. At precisely 11:30, the guest of honor arrived. Mr. Lionel Bartlett swept into the gathering with a confidence that was almost theatrical. He was a man of 50, handsome in a way that had not aged gracefully. Too much pomade in the hair, too much charm in the smile. Formerly of the Colonial Office, he had retired early and purchased the old Havisham property on the edge of the village. His arrival 6 months prior had set tongues wagging, for he was both wealthy and unmarried, a combination that made him an object of fascination and speculation alike. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said in his pleasant baritone, doffing his straw hat with exaggerated gallantry as he passed her table. "I trust you're enjoying this charming chaos?" Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Very much so, Mr. Bartlett. Picnics have a way of showing people as they truly are. One learns more from sandwiches than one might expect." He laughed heartily, though his eyes darted elsewhere, toward Mrs. Pamela Whittaker, the doctor's wife, who stood near the lemonade tent, adjusting her sun hat with nervous fingers. Miss Marple's needles clicked, twice in succession. By noon, the picnic had reached its cheerful height. The air was full of laughter, gossip, and the smell of cucumber sandwiches. Mr. Bartlett was in his element, charming the ladies, flattering the vicar, and ensuring everyone heard a few amusing stories from his diplomatic years abroad. Mrs. Whittaker blushed more than once under his gaze, though her husband, Dr. Whittaker, seemed not to notice, or pretended not to. It was during the raffle that the first note of discord was struck. The vicar's wife had just drawn the winning ticket for a large basket of preserves when a commotion arose near the far end of the green. 2 children were calling for their mother, their cries mingling with the sudden scrape of a toppled chair. A murmur passed through the crowd as heads turned, and then someone exclaimed, "Good heavens, Mr. Bartlett!" Miss Marple, rising with the agility of one half her age, followed the sudden rush of bodies toward the lemonade tent. There, beneath the dappled shade of the oaks, Lionel Bartlett lay slumped against the side of a table, one hand clutching at his chest. His straw hat had rolled away, and a half-filled glass of lemonade was overturned beside him, its contents trickling through the grass. Dr. Whittaker was already kneeling beside the fallen man, his medical bag fetched in moments by a quick-thinking boy. "Stand back, please, give him air," he commanded, his voice tense. Mrs. Whittaker stood a few paces away, her face drained of color. After what felt like an age, the doctor rose, his expression grim. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done." A collective gasp went up, followed by the uneasy murmuring of 100 voices. Mrs. Weatherby clasped her hands and declared faintly that someone must fetch the constable. Children were hurried away, their mothers whispering urgently. Miss Marple stood quite still, her eyes not on the dead man, but on the small details surrounding him. The position of the overturned glass, the faint ring of dampness on the tablecloth, and the curious fact that a bee, trapped beneath a napkin, buzzed weakly against the fabric. When the constable arrived, young Sergeant Davis, earnest and eager, he did his best to restore order. "Likely his heart, poor fellow," he said after a brief consultation with Dr. Whittaker. "Hot day, excitement, perhaps too much wine at luncheon." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple, more to herself than anyone else. "It does look that way, though I can't help thinking Mr. Bartlett was not the sort to leave this world quietly. There's something rather deliberate about it all." She glanced once more at the lemonade glass, where a few drops of liquid clung stubbornly to the rim. A faint scent lingered, sharp, almost bitter. She said nothing more, only folded her knitting neatly and placed it in her basket. Around her, the picnic continued in uneasy fragments, voices hushed, eyes darting. The laughter of an hour ago had vanished entirely, replaced by the nervous murmurs of speculation that would soon ripple through every cottage in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her face serene. To any casual observer, she seemed merely saddened by the tragedy. But beneath that placid exterior, her mind was already turning. For in a village like St. Mary Mead, death was rarely as simple as it first appeared. And Miss Marple knew from long and sometimes painful observation that behind every polite smile lay the potential for scandal. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was awash in gossip as lively and persistent as the morning mist. The tragic death of Mr. Lionel Bartlett at the village picnic had become, in less than 24 hours, the chief subject of conversation from the vicarage to the post office. Every household offered its own version of events, each slightly more embellished than the last. At the Bluebird Tea Rooms, that dainty little establishment on the high street where one could rely on a respectable pot of Darjeeling and an indecent amount of speculation, the atmosphere was electric. Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife and self-appointed guardian of moral decency, occupied her usual corner table. Opposite her sat Mrs. Hartnell, a formidable woman of sturdy opinions and an even sturdier bosom, who prided herself on knowing how people tick. Between them lay a plate of shortbread and a copy of the Daily Mail, folded to the obituary section. "I dare say it was his heart," Mrs. Weatherby murmured, stirring her tea in slow, mournful circles. Dr. Whittaker said as much. Still, one never expects such things to happen in public. Quite a shock for the children. Mrs. Hartnell sniffed. "Heart, indeed. You mark my words, there's more to it than that. I heard from Ethel, who heard from her cousin who helps out at the chemist's, that Mr. Bartlett was asking questions about certain prescriptions. Rather curious, don't you think? And that poor Mrs. Whittaker turning pale as milk. Suspicious, if you ask me." Mrs. Weatherby gasped. "Surely you can't mean Dr. Whittaker's wife?" "Well, I'm not saying anything definite," Mrs. Hartnell said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "But people don't go about looking stricken at a picnic unless there's a reason. Besides, everyone knows she and Mr. Bartlett were, well, friendly." At the next table, unnoticed by most, Miss Marple sipped her tea with perfect composure. Her expression was one of mild interest, the look of a woman quietly listening without seeming to. She had chosen a seat by the window, her knitting once again in her lap, and appeared entirely absorbed in the pattern of her needles. But every word reached her sharp ears. Gossip, she often thought, was like smoke. It might obscure the truth, but it always hinted at where the fire was burning. Presently, Miss Hartnell's voice rose again. And another thing. I saw that young man, the one from the Havisham estate, loitering by the lemonade tent just before the poor gentleman fell. What's his name again? George Latham, Mrs. Weatherby supplied. Mr. Bartlett's groundskeeper, very polite young man, I'm sure, always tips his hat. Politeness doesn't count for much when there's money involved, said Mrs. Hartnell darkly, and they say Mr. Bartlett wasn't the kind to pay his servants generously. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. George Latham. Yes, she remembered him well enough. A quiet, wiry fellow, devoted to his work with an expression of perpetual unease. She had once seen him walking home from the village late at night, looking as though the weight of the world sat on his narrow shoulders. The bell above the tea-room door jingled then, admitting the doctor's wife herself, Mrs. Pamela Whitaker. The lively murmur of conversation faltered instantly, replaced by an awkward hush that made the poor woman's entrance all the more painful. She was dressed in subdued grey, her hat pulled low, and though she carried herself with dignity, her eyes darted nervously about the room. "Pamela, my dear," Mrs. Weatherby called with brittle cheer. "Come, join us. We were just reminiscing about yesterday's dreadful business." Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, then nodded faintly and took a seat. "Yes, dreadful. So very sudden. My husband is still quite shaken." "I'm sure he is," said Mrs. Hartnell, watching her closely. "Such an upstanding man, the doctor. But tell me, Mrs. Whitaker, did you happen to notice whether Mr. Bartlett seemed unwell before it happened? One never knows when these spells may come on." The younger woman's teacup rattled faintly in its saucer. I couldn't say. He seemed in good spirits. Quite himself." "Ah." Mrs. Hartnell's tone carried a weight of implication heavy enough to sink a ship. Miss Marple chose that moment to interject, her voice mild as warm milk. It was the lemonade, wasn't it? Such a refreshing choice on a hot day. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. "I was only thinking," Miss Marple continued pleasantly, "that Mr. Bartlett did seem rather fond of the lemonade stand. I believe he had more than 1 glass. Perhaps it didn't agree with him. One never knows how these things affect the digestion." Mrs. Weatherby looked alarmed. "You mean poisoned lemonade?" "Oh, dear me, no," Miss Marple said, smiling benignly. "I only meant that one mustn't leap to conclusions. Still, it is interesting how often the simplest things in life, a cup of tea, a glass of lemonade, can prove surprisingly consequential." Mrs. Whitaker rose abruptly, murmuring that she must get home. As she left, Miss Marple's gaze followed her, not in suspicion, but in quiet pity. There was guilt there, yes, but not the guilt of murder. It was the guilt of someone who knew more than she wished to. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the post office under the pretense of buying stamps. There she encountered young George Latham, who stood awkwardly at the counter, a telegram form clutched in his rough hand. He started slightly at seeing her. "Good afternoon, George," she said kindly. "Terrible business yesterday. You were close to Mr. Bartlett, were you not?" He hesitated. "Worked for him, miss. Close as a man can be to a master like that." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Not the easiest man, perhaps?" George looked down. Let's just say he had ways. Knew how to make a man feel small, but I didn't wish him dead, if that's what folk are saying. "No one should think such a thing," Miss Marple said gently. "Still, it's remarkable how quickly words travel in a small village, almost as though they had wings." He gave her a startled glance, as though suspecting she meant more than she said. She only smiled and added, "Do give your mother my regards. I hope her rheumatism isn't troubling her too much in this damp weather." When she left the post office, the sky had turned grey, clouds gathering over the thatched rooftops like a curtain drawn before a performance. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her cottage, the gravel crunching beneath her sensible shoes. The village was restless, uneasy. Every window seemed to hide a watcher. Every whispered conversation stopped when footsteps approached. And though most would dismiss Mr. Bartlett's death as an unfortunate accident, Miss Marple had already begun to sense that under the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, something darker stirred. It was not yet clear what: jealousy, greed, humiliation perhaps. But the scent of it hung in the air, faint and acrid as the aftertaste of lemonade left too long in the sun. The inquest into Mr. Lionel Bartlett's death was held 2 days later in the draughty back room of the parish hall, a space usually reserved for choir practice and jumble sales, not for pronouncements of mortality. Yet on that Tuesday morning the chairs were filled, the air thick with curiosity, and the faint smell of furniture polish. Miss Marple arrived early, quietly slipping into a corner seat near the back, where she could observe without being observed. She had brought her knitting, of course, a small grey shawl this time, and her hands worked with unhurried precision as the proceedings began. Sergeant Davis, looking far graver than usual, stood beside the coroner's desk, reading from his notes. Deceased identified as Mr. Lionel Bartlett, aged 51, residing at Havisham House. Collapsed suddenly at approximately 12:30 p.m. during the annual St. Mary Mead picnic. Declared dead on the scene by Dr. Whittaker. The coroner, a solemn man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, nodded gravely. "And the cause of death, Doctor?" Dr. Whittaker, standing a little apart from the others, adjusted his collar before replying. "At first, I assumed heart failure. However, upon closer examination, and with the assistance of the county pathologist, it appears that Mr. Bartlett died from digitalis poisoning." The murmuring that followed was immediate and explosive. Miss Marple did not look up from her knitting, though her needles paused mid-stitch. "Order, please," the coroner barked. "You're certain of this, Doctor?" "Quite certain," said Dr. Whittaker, his voice tight. "Digitalis, in concentrated form, was present in the stomach contents. It acts swiftly, and the symptoms can mimic cardiac arrest." Miss Marple's mind turned quietly over this revelation. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, a plant both beautiful and deadly, growing freely in many of the gardens around St. Mary Mead. It could be prepared easily enough by someone with rudimentary knowledge of herbs. "Sergeant Davis," the coroner said, turning to the young constable. "Has any arrest been made?" The sergeant cleared his throat. "Not as yet, sir, but, well, certain evidence points toward an individual of interest." Every head in the hall tilted forward slightly. "George Latham," Davis continued reluctantly, "the deceased's gardener. He was seen serving lemonade at the tent shortly before Mr. Bartlett's collapse. Moreover, witnesses recall he had a quarrel with Mr. Bartlett the evening prior, about wages and living arrangements, and according to Mr. Bartlett's housekeeper, a bottle of digitalis tincture kept in the estate's shed for treating the hounds, sir, is missing." A low ripple spread through the villagers like the wind rustling through reeds. "Digitalis tincture," murmured Miss Marple softly, as though tasting the words. "For the hounds, indeed." George was brought forward, pale, anxious, his cap clutched in his hands. "I didn't do it, sir," he said immediately, his voice trembling. "I never touched that bottle, I swear. Mr. Bartlett, he weren't an easy man, but I'd never harm him, far." The coroner eyed him sternly. "Were you at the lemonade tent that morning?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Weatherby asked me to help carry a crate." "I didn't serve no one directly. I just set things down and left." Sergeant Davis consulted his notes. "Yet Mrs. Calthorpe states she saw you hand a glass of lemonade to Mr. Bartlett himself." George looked bewildered. "She's mistaken, sir. I was near the tent, but it wasn't me served him. There were others about. Mrs. Whittaker, for one. She poured him a glass. I remember that clear as day." A rustle of surprise went through the audience. Mrs. Whittaker, seated in the front row beside her husband, turned ghostly white. Dr. Whittaker's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Miss Marple observed the exchange through the rhythmic movement of her needles. How fascinating, she thought, that guilt could travel visibly across faces, like a shadow passing over water. After another half-hour of testimony, the coroner adjourned the session, pending further inquiry. Sergeant Davis, flushed with the weight of his duty, stepped aside to confer with Dr. Whitaker. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and made her way toward the door. She moved slowly, not from infirmity, but from calculation. And as she passed George, who sat slumped on a bench, she paused. "Such a dreadful business," she said kindly. "Foxglove is a treacherous flower, isn't it? Looks so pretty in the borders, and yet I always tell my neighbors never to let the children handle it." George raised his head miserably. "They'll think I done it, miss, all of 'em, but I swear on my mother's grave I didn't touch that lemonade." Miss Marple patted his hand. "I quite believe you. You see, guilt is like soil on the hands. It never truly brushes off, no matter how one scrubs. And yours seem very clean indeed." She left him looking after her, puzzled and faintly hopeful. That afternoon, the village hummed anew with certainty. The general consensus was that the matter was all but solved. Mrs. Hartnell declared to anyone who would listen that she had always suspected that young man. Mrs. Weatherby, in a flutter of moral indignation, announced that no decent Christian household could tolerate such wickedness. But Miss Marple, pouring herself a quiet cup of tea in her parlor, remained unconvinced. She reviewed the facts as she saw them. The poison was digitalis, easily accessible but requiring knowledge of dosage. George Latham was near the lemonade, but so was Mrs. Whitaker. Mr. Bartlett's death benefited someone, perhaps not materially, but in some other, subtler fashion. Her eyes strayed to the little vase of foxgloves on her table, their purple throats gleaming in the afternoon sun. A curious choice of flower, she mused, given recent events. Yet she had picked them herself that morning from the lane, as if to remind her how easily beauty and danger coexisted. As dusk fell, there was a knock on her door. It was Sergeant Davis, hat in hand, looking uncertain. "Evening, Miss Marple. Thought I'd best tell you. We're taking George Latham into custody tonight. The coroner's all but certain." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "You're quite sure that's wise, Sergeant?" He frowned. "The evidence seems plain enough." "Indeed," she said softly. "And yet, I've often found that the plainest evidence can sometimes conceal the most intricate truths. You know, I once had a cat that was forever blamed for stealing the cream, until I discovered it was the maid helping herself before breakfast. Appearances, Sergeant, are frightfully misleading." Davis shifted uncomfortably. "You think he's innocent, then?" "I think," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile, "that truth, like foxglove, must be handled with care, or one may find oneself poisoned by it." When the young man left, she sat quietly for a long while, the shadows lengthening across the cottage floor. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, and the village settled into uneasy silence. But Miss Marple's mind did not rest. There was something she had missed, some small, ordinary thing that would make the whole picture clear. And until she found it, she knew the real murderer would sleep as soundly as a fox among the hens. 2 mornings later, the sun rose bright over St. Mary Mead, as though the heavens had decided to mock the village's unease with cheerful weather. Birds trilled, shopkeepers swept their thresholds, and from the open window of Miss Marple's cottage drifted the faint clink of china and the whistle of a boiling kettle. To an outsider, everything might have seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet beneath that serene facade, tension had settled over the village like a fine dust. George Latham's arrest had been the talk of every breakfast table. Some thought justice had been done. Others whispered that it had all been too quick, too neat. Miss Marple belonged firmly to the latter group. She sat at her table buttering a slice of toast when her maid, young Gladys, entered with a vase of flowers. "Picked these from the vicar's garden, ma'am. He said they were for you. Bit of colour to cheer the place up." Miss Marple looked up with a smile. "How very kind of him. Oh, such a pretty arrangement. Daisies, lavender, and foxgloves again, I see." Gladys brightened. "Yes, ma'am. They do look fine in the light, don't they?" "Indeed they do," Miss Marple murmured, studying the tall, elegant blooms. Then, in a tone of mild concern, she added, "Do be careful when handling them, dear. The sap can be rather unkind to the skin." Gladys blinked. "Oh, I didn't know that, ma'am. I'll remember." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat quite still, her toast forgotten. Foxgloves again. Ever since Mr. Bartlett's death, the flowers seemed to follow her. At the picnic, at the inquest, now in her own sitting room. Coincidence, perhaps. And yet she had long ago ceased to believe in coincidences. She rose and carried the vase to the window. The morning sun struck through the petals, illuminating the speckled throats of the blossoms, deep purple with lighter freckles, like a warning written in nature's script. It was then that she noticed something peculiar, a faint, powdery residue on one of the stems, pale yellow, clinging to the green like dust. She brushed it lightly with a fingertip, then examined the mark against the light. "Pollen," she said softly, "but not from foxglove, I think." A short while later, Miss Marple was strolling along the lane that led to Havisham House. She carried a small basket of scones, ostensibly for the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, who had known her since childhood. In truth, Miss Marple wanted to see the late Mr. Bartlett's gardens for herself. Mrs. Gibbs greeted her at the door, red-eyed and flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all been such a dreadful time. Poor Mr. Bartlett, and that nice George locked away like a criminal. I can hardly sleep for the worry of it." "I quite understand, my dear," said Miss Marple soothingly. "Perhaps a little air would do us good. Would you walk me round the garden? I've always admired the way Mr. Bartlett laid out his borders." Mrs. Gibbs hesitated, then nodded gratefully. "Well, I suppose it can't hurt." The gardens were immaculate. Mr. Bartlett had been proud of them, rows of delphiniums, marigolds and roses stretched in perfect symmetry. Yet Miss Marple's eye was drawn to the far end, near the stone shed. There, the flower beds grew wilder, the order giving way to tangled patches of herbs and foxgloves that rose in unruly profusion. Mr. Bartlett liked to dabble in herbal tonics, Mrs. Gibbs explained. Said they reminded him of his time in India. He kept his tinctures and such in that shed yonder. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her gaze soft but sharp. "And would anyone else have access to it?" "Well, George, of course, for the hounds, and the doctor's wife sometimes. Mrs. Whittaker came by now and then to collect herbs. She and Mr. Bartlett got on famously over their gardening, they did." "Ah, yes," murmured Miss Marple. "Mrs. Whittaker, such a delicate creature. One might not think her strong enough for outdoor work." Mrs. Gibbs gave a small, scandalized laugh. "Oh, she was strong enough when she needed to be. I dare say there was more steel in her than people guessed." As they returned to the main path, Miss Marple paused before a small patch of withered foxglove, their stems freshly cut. "Strange," she said mildly. "These look as though they were harvested recently, though Mr. Bartlett's been gone a week." Mrs. Gibbs frowned. "Now that you mention it, I did hear someone in the garden the evening after the funeral. Thought it was Sergeant Davis making inquiries, but perhaps not." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind hummed with new possibilities. Someone had returned to the scene, not out of sentiment, but necessity. That afternoon, back at her cottage, she fetched her magnifying glass. A simple thing, but one that had helped her more than once. Examining the residue she had brushed from the flower stem, she confirmed her suspicion. It was not foxglove pollen at all, but something finer, almost crystalline. Soap residue, perhaps. Or talcum. She recalled then how Mrs. Whittaker's hands had trembled at the tea-room, pale and powdered, the faint scent of lilies about her. A nervous habit, or the residue of something more deliberate? Just as she was pondering this, a knock sounded at the door. It was Dr. Whittaker himself. He looked tired, his face drawn, but his manner was courteous. "Miss Marple," he began, "I wanted to thank you for speaking kindly of my wife the other day. She's been quite unwell with all the talk going around." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said gently. "It must be dreadful to have one's name whispered about in a small place like ours. People mean well, but they rarely understand." He sighed deeply. "Pamela's a sensitive woman. She's easily led by emotion. Mr. Bartlett had a way of flattering her, and I fear she mistook his attention for genuine friendship. It's all been most unfortunate." Miss Marple's blue eyes regarded him steadily. "Unfortunate indeed. Though I wonder, Doctor, if perhaps Mr. Bartlett's charm might have been more dangerous than even your wife suspected." The doctor stiffened slightly. "What are you implying?" "Oh, nothing at all," said Miss Marple mildly, pouring tea. "Only that some men enjoy making others dance to their tune, and occasionally one of the dancers grows tired of the music." He left soon after, clearly unsettled. Miss Marple watched him go with quiet reflection. She was not yet certain whether Dr. Whittaker was protecting his wife, or whether both of them hid something more complicated. As twilight fell, she wandered once more to the vase of flowers. The foxgloves stood tall, their purple bells luminous in the fading light. She touched one gently, her voice a whisper. "Beauty concealing death. How very human of you." And beneath her fingertips, she thought she could almost feel the pulse of the truth, faint but growing stronger, like the first stirrings of a storm yet to break. The village of St. Mary Mead, which had seemed so quaint and peaceful only days before, was now suffused with a palpable tension. Gossip had settled like a persistent fog, curling into every corner of the high street, whispering behind lace curtains and draping itself over the unsuspecting shoulders of villagers who tried desperately to go about their daily routines. Miss Marple, however, moved through the village with the same quiet composure as ever, her mind working steadily beneath the surface. She had begun to notice patterns, subtle hints in behavior, the nervous twitch of a hand, the way a voice faltered when discussing Mr. Bartlett. Such clues, she knew, revealed far more than the most meticulous of police interrogations. That morning, she visited the vicarage to call upon Mrs. Weatherby. The vicar's wife, though ever polite, could hardly contain her curiosity. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, "do sit down. One cannot help but feel that there is some deeper truth here, something the authorities may have overlooked." Miss Marple accepted the invitation and seated herself near the window, her knitting basket on her lap. "Curious indeed," she murmured. "People are rarely as simple as they appear. Even the most unassuming of neighbors may have something to hide." Mrs. Weatherby nodded eagerly. "Mr. Bartlett, such a charming man on the surface. Yet I dare say he had a knack for finding weaknesses in others. The village, I fear, may be full of hidden resentments we have scarcely imagined." Miss Marple sipped her tea and considered this. Did he have any particularly close friends? Anyone who might have been disappointed or displeased in some way? Mrs. Weatherby thought for a moment, frowning. "Well, there was Mrs. Whittaker, of course, and of course the staff at Havisham. Young George, though honest, was never quite satisfied with his position. And then there's Miss Hargreaves. Mr. Bartlett was known to be rather attentive to her at the summer fairs. But she, of course, is rather sharp and perceptive. I cannot imagine her being involved in anything untoward." Miss Marple nodded, though her eyes gleamed faintly with awareness. Attentive, yes. But there was something in human nature that sometimes caused even the most sensible people to act in ways one could not foresee. And Mr. Bartlett himself? Any known enemies? Rivalries? Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened. Enemies? My dear, he was outwardly polite to everyone, but one could always detect a subtle air of condescension. He enjoyed being admired, yes, but he had a tendency to provoke, unintentionally, I believe. That, I suspect, could be considered an enemy of sorts. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Unintentional provocations often produce the sharpest resentments, and people rarely forget. After her visit, Miss Marple wandered slowly through the village streets, observing the daily rhythms, the baker's boy carrying loaves with care, the butcher arguing gently with a customer over the price of lamb, and the postman pausing to exchange a brief word with Mrs. Calthorpe. Everywhere she looked, she noted subtle reactions, the way a glance lingered, the flicker of a hand, the half-smile of someone observing a neighbor's misfortune with concealed satisfaction. She recalled the moment at the picnic when Mr. Bartlett had laughed with such confident charm. How many of the villagers had been flattered, entertained, or distracted by his personality? And how many, she wondered, had secretly seethed at his arrogance, his subtle displays of superiority? The seeds of envy, jealousy, or resentment, she knew, could easily mature into more dangerous inclinations. Later, as she approached Havisham House under the pretense of delivering a basket of freshly baked scones to Mrs. Gibbs, she noted the stillness of the gardens. No one appeared, and even the hounds were silent, save for the occasional rustle of a hedgerow. She passed the stone shed once more, her gaze lingering on the small foxglove patch where the digitalis tincture had been kept. Mrs. Gibbs answered her knock, looking tired but cordial. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Please, come in. You're very kind to bring these." As she entered the house, Miss Marple's eyes took in the subtle details. A chair slightly askew, a teacup on the counter with a faint lipstick mark, the faint aroma of lavender lingering in the air. Every small thing, she knew, might hold significance. "Mrs. Gibbs," she said softly, "I was wondering, did Mr. Bartlett ever speak of any worries? Anything that might have troubled him recently?" The housekeeper pursed her lips. "Not that I can recall. He was, on the whole, contented with life here, though there was a letter he received last week. Seemed to upset him more than he let on. I never saw it, but he folded it carefully and locked it in his desk drawer." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. Letters often carried truths that words spoken aloud would not. "Do you know who it was from?" "No, ma'am," he never said, just frowned and shook his head. The revelation added a new layer to the puzzle. Someone had reached Mr. Bartlett, someone with knowledge, leverage, or intent. It was an unseen hand, perhaps invisible to all but Miss Marple herself. As she left Havisham House, she reflected on the villagers' behaviors, the subtle tensions, and the hidden resentments. Even those who seemed innocuous, young George, Mrs. Whittaker, Miss Hargreaves, all had aspects of their lives touched by Mr. Bartlett's presence, some more intimately than others. By the time she returned home, dusk had settled over St. Mary Mead. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with the faint smell of the garden after the day's watering. Miss Marple sat by her window, contemplating the delicate web of human emotions that connected every resident of the village to Mr. Bartlett's fate. She picked up her knitting once more, allowing her mind to follow the threads of suspicion, resentment, and secret desires. Somewhere in that network of relationships lay the answer, the identity of the person who had turned the picnic from a celebration into a tragedy. And Miss Marple knew, with her characteristic certainty, that it was a truth hidden not in dramatic gestures or forced confessions, but in the small, almost imperceptible signs that only a careful observer could discern. The following morning, St. Mary Mead seemed to hum with whispers. Even the wind through the trees carried an undertone of suspicion, as if nature itself had joined in the village's unease. Miss Marple, walking slowly through the high street, noted the subtle changes in familiar faces. A furtive glance here, a tightened jaw there. Gossip, she reflected, was never content to remain idle. It fed upon the smallest fractures in human behavior, growing stronger with each retelling. At the post office, Mrs. Calthorpe leaned conspiratorially over the counter. "Did you hear?" she whispered to a passing neighbor, glancing at Miss Marple with a mixture of excitement and fear. "They say George Latham is in custody, and some folk are claiming he acted out of vengeance. Can you imagine? The poor boy, yet the sergeant seems convinced." Miss Marple merely nodded in acknowledgement, smiling faintly to herself. It was not unusual for people to assume the most straightforward explanations. They preferred certainty, even if it was wrong. Later, she visited the vicarage, seeking the vicar's counsel under the pretense of discussing parish business. Mrs. Weatherby greeted her warmly, yet her eyes were shadowed with concern. "Miss Marple, I cannot help but worry. The villagers are frightened. Everyone talks of what might happen next, and poor Pamela Whittaker. She is barely eating, barely speaking." Miss Marple poured herself tea and observed quietly. "Fear has a way of colouring everything," she said, "and people are seldom honest about what frightens them most. Sometimes they even deceive themselves." The conversation shifted naturally to Mr. Bartlett, and Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward. He was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. I suspect that beneath the smiles, many harboured resentment. Not just George either. There are whispers about Miss Hargreaves and even the Whittakers themselves. One cannot simply ignore human envy. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled softly. "Envy is an insidious companion, isn't it? It can turn the kindest gesture into a perceived insult and the smallest oversight into a lasting grievance." After leaving the vicarage, she wandered toward the park where the picnic had taken place. Though the tents were gone and the remnants of the event cleared, the memory lingered. The lemonade stand, the wicker baskets, the clinking of glasses. It was as though the very air held a record of the day. She spotted Miss Hargreaves sitting alone on a bench, her posture unusually rigid, her eyes fixed on the distant hills. Miss Marple approached gently. "Miss Hargreaves," she said softly, "may I join you?" The young woman hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple." They sat in silence for a few moments, watching the slow drift of autumn leaves. Miss Marple began conversationally. "It must have been a shock, the picnic turning so tragic. I imagine you knew Mr. Bartlett well." Miss Hargreaves' lips pressed together. We were friendly, I suppose. But I hardly knew the real man. Charming, yes, and clever. But there were things he said and did that left one uneasy. Subtle manipulations. Flattery used to gain trust. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Flattery can be a dangerous weapon when wielded indiscriminately. And sometimes those who appear weakest react in ways others would never anticipate. The conversation revealed small cracks in the young woman's composure. She spoke cautiously about her own interactions with Mr. Bartlett, hinting at a mixture of admiration and discomfort. Yet she did not incriminate herself. As Miss Marple walked back toward the village, she passed the doctor's house. She noted the blinds drawn low, the faint aroma of lilac and soap wafting through a slightly opened window. There was an air of tension there, almost as if the household itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple's keen observation of the villagers' subtle behaviors continued throughout the day. She noticed Mrs. Hartnell speaking in hurried tones with the postmaster, her gestures sharp and anxious. She observed George Latham's mother peering out from behind lace curtains, eyes wide with worry and pride in equal measure. Even the younger children seemed quieter, as though sensing the heavy cloud of suspicion hanging over their families. That evening, she visited her own garden to gather her thoughts. The foxgloves still stood tall, their purple bells catching the fading light. She reflected on the web of human emotion she had witnessed: jealousy, fear, pride, love, and resentment intertwined in a complicated tapestry. Miss Marple's intuition told her that the real culprit was someone whose outward composure was flawless, who had skillfully hidden resentment beneath layers of politeness and charm. Yet there was a detail, tiny, almost imperceptible, that had eluded everyone else. She recalled the lemonade tent, the subtle hand movements, the hesitation of certain individuals when speaking of the day, and the residue on the foxgloves she had examined earlier. Every clue, she realized, formed a pattern, and it was a pattern that the village, eager to assign blame to the obvious suspect, had completely overlooked. Night fell over St. Mary Mead, and the village grew quiet once more. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting steadily, her mind weaving together the threads of what she had seen and heard. She understood that the whispers of the village were not idle chatter. They were reflections of hidden truths, half-told stories, and the faintest hints of human weakness. And within those whispers, Miss Marple knew, lay the key to the mystery. The secret that would ultimately reveal who had turned a bright, sunny picnic into a scene of sudden, tragic death. The following morning, Miss Marple set out on a leisurely walk along the lane leading to Havisham House, her mind preoccupied with the threads she had been quietly following for days. The village, as always, was alive with movement. The postman delivering letters with a brisk efficiency, Mrs. Calthorpe fussing over her flowers, and children skipping stones into the small stream that ran parallel to the lane. Yet, amidst these ordinary motions, Miss Marple's eyes remained vigilant, observing patterns invisible to all but the most attentive. As she approached the stone shed, she noted a subtle change. The foxglove patch, which had seemed untouched since her last visit, bore signs of disturbance. Faint footprints pressed into the soft earth, and a slight bend to the tallest stems, as though someone had leaned over them recently. A delicate trail of powdery residue glimmered faintly in the morning light, almost invisible to the casual observer. Miss Marple crouched to examine it, her knitting basket set aside. The powder was finer than she had expected, almost crystalline, and caught the sun like tiny fragments of mica. She frowned thoughtfully. It was not soil from the path, nor dust from the wind. Someone had handled the plants carefully, deliberately, a hand that had lingered. She rose and continued toward the garden's main area. There, amidst the otherwise impeccable borders, she noticed a scrap of paper tucked beneath a rose bush. It was small, almost unremarkable, yet the corner was marked with a faint fingerprint smudged in haste. Carefully, she retrieved it and examined the contents. It was a note, hastily scribbled. "He cannot know. The arrangements must be made tonight. Everything depends on it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Such a note suggested urgency and secrecy, and yet the handwriting was deliberately disguised, as though the writer wished to conceal their identity. The choice of hiding it beneath a rose, a symbol of affection and yet of concealment, spoke volumes about the person's intention. As she considered the note, she recalled Dr. Whitaker's visit to her cottage the previous day and the subtle tension in his manner. Had he been protective of his wife? Or was there another layer, more intricate and concealed, waiting to be discovered? She wandered further, noticing for the first time a small gate leading to the farthest corner of the estate. It was usually locked, but today it stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple's curiosity, never idle, drew her closer. Beyond it lay a narrow path, overgrown but traversable, leading to a tiny orchard. Among the trees, she spotted something peculiar, a small tin box, partially buried beneath a scattering of fallen leaves. Gently, she lifted it. Inside were several small bottles, each labeled in neat script. One bottle, in particular, caught her attention, a concentrated tincture of digitalis. The cork had been disturbed, and the contents slightly diminished. A faint scent lingered in the air, unmistakably the same bitter aroma she had detected at the picnic. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the connections. The foxglove residue, the hastily written note, and the disturbed digitalis tincture all pointed to premeditation. This was no impulsive act. Someone had planned the event with precision, timing it to coincide with the village picnic, knowing the crowd would provide both distraction and opportunity. Returning along the lane toward the village, she reflected on the implications. The clues suggested an intimate knowledge of both the estate and the habits of its residents. A stranger could not have acted so confidently. The perpetrator must be someone embedded within the routines of Havisham House, someone who could move unnoticed, manipulate appearances, and exploit trust. By the time she reached her cottage, Miss Marple had a clear sense of direction, though the identity of the culprit remained elusive. She arranged her observations on a small piece of paper, mapping connections between individuals and noting inconsistencies in their stories. It was a slow process, one that required patience and a keen understanding of human nature, but she knew that the answer lay not in forceful evidence, but in subtle behavior. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed calm again, though a restless energy lingered beneath the surface. The residents had begun to whisper about the note, the missing bottle, and the events of the picnic, each interpretation more dramatic than the last. Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting in hand, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had found a thread that others had overlooked. A delicate, almost imperceptible clue that might unravel the carefully constructed facade of innocence. Somewhere, she thought, the person responsible for Mr. Bartlett's death was walking the village streets, confident that their secret was safe. Yet Miss Marple's quiet observations and careful reasoning were steadily closing the circle. The truth, as always, was waiting to reveal itself, and she would be ready when it did. The following day, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed quieter than usual, the usual morning bustle subdued as if the town itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, seated at her window with a cup of tea, contemplated the patterns she had uncovered. She had discovered the hidden note, the disturbed foxglove patch, and the partially used digitalis tincture. All were small, subtle signs, yet to Miss Marple they formed a coherent outline of intent. Human motives, she knew, were rarely simple. Jealousy, fear, resentment, pride, love. These emotions intertwined, creating a web that could ensnare the most cautious of people. The challenge was to understand which of the villagers had been entangled, and in what way, in Mr. Bartlett's death. Her first thoughts turned to George Latham, the young gardener, the village's most obvious suspect. He had quarreled with Mr. Bartlett over wages, and the sergeant had been quick to interpret his presence at the lemonade tent as guilt. Yet Miss Marple had observed him closely. George's nervous glances were not the signs of a calculating criminal, but of a frightened young man who felt trapped by circumstance. His fingers were clean, his hands steady when handling her knitting yarn, the very steadiness of which one would not expect from someone guilty of deliberate murder. Then there was Mrs. Whittaker, a delicate, soft-spoken woman whose hands had betrayed subtle signs of handling the foxgloves. Her anxiety was visible when her husband had spoken of her involvement in the garden. Miss Marple pondered this carefully. Pamela. Whittaker had reason to resent Mr. Bartlett. His charming manipulations, his ability to make others feel inadequate, his unsettling attentions. Could fear or wounded pride have driven her to a desperate act? She seemed mild, fragile even, yet Miss Marple knew well that a quiet exterior could conceal an iron will. Miss Hargreaves presented a different challenge. She had been flattered by Mr. Bartlett's attentions, and while her reactions had been carefully measured, her discomfort suggested a deeper, more personal grievance. Perhaps she had discovered something untoward about him, some hidden arrogance or deception that he believed no one had perceived. Her intelligence and perceptiveness, while admirable, also made her capable of scheming in ways that could be nearly invisible. Dr. Whittaker, too, occupied Miss Marple's thoughts. He had spoken gently of protecting his wife, yet his careful avoidance of certain topics suggested a desire to shield not only her, but perhaps some other secret as well. He was accustomed to authority, confident in his knowledge and position, and capable of maintaining appearances flawlessly. The doctor's demeanor at the inquest and in his visit to Miss Marple's cottage had been calculated, measured, and yet beneath the surface, something seemed slightly off, a hesitation almost imperceptible but telling. Even minor villagers, like Mrs. Hartnell and Mrs. Weatherby, contributed threads to the tapestry. Their gossip, their urgent whispers, their almost gleeful delight in discussing misfortune hinted at long-buried resentments or rivalries. Miss Marple knew that often the people least suspected were those most skilled at maintaining an air of propriety, while their hidden emotions guided subtle actions. As she knitted, Miss Marple thought carefully about opportunity. The perpetrator had to have access to both the estate and the lemonade, knowledge of Mr. Bartlett's routines, and enough composure to move unnoticed among the crowd. The person must also have known how to prepare the digitalis, not a detail for the careless or unthinking. Her mind returned to the scrap of paper she had found, hastily written and deliberately hidden. It was a silent testament to premeditation. Only someone with both access and forethought could have orchestrated such an event. The urgency implied in the note suggested a deeper motive, perhaps an emotional grievance, perhaps a calculated response to some slight or humiliation. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and picked up a small notebook. She listed each suspect, noting their possible motives, their opportunity, and their behavioral signs. For George, motive was weak, opportunity plausible but unremarkable. For Mrs. Whittaker, motive was moderate, opportunity excellent, composure delicate yet potentially deceptive. Miss Hargreaves had motive moderate, opportunity limited but plausible, intellect high. Dr. Whittaker, motive uncertain but possibly linked to protecting another, opportunity excellent, composure unshakable. By the time the village clock struck 6, Miss Marple had reached a tentative conclusion. The simplest solution, that George acted in vengeance, could not account for the sophistication of the crime. The digitalis, the careful timing, and the hidden note pointed to someone far more deliberate. The killer was not merely reacting, they were orchestrating, manipulating, and concealing with precision. Yet she was still missing a crucial piece. The final spark that would reveal not only who had done it, but why. The human heart, she reminded herself, could be a labyrinth. Sometimes the tiniest misstep, the faintest expression, or the briefest hesitation was enough to illuminate a path through it. Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea and settled in by the window, gazing at the village as the sky deepened into the soft purples and pinks of dusk. Somewhere in those quiet streets walked the person responsible for the tragedy at the picnic. They may have smiled at neighbors, exchanged polite words, and carried on as though nothing had happened. Yet Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, was watching and waiting. When the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared, she picked up her knitting once more. Every stitch, she reflected, was like a thread of human behavior, connecting cause and effect, desire and consequence. And somewhere within that intricate pattern lay the truth that would soon emerge, as precise and inevitable as the falling of a stitch in her careful work. Miss Marple had long understood that human nature could reveal its truths most clearly when a person believed themselves unobserved, or when a small provocation prompted an instinctive reaction. By the 9th day since the tragic picnic, she had collected a great deal of information: the hidden note, the disturbed foxglove patch, the partially used digitalist tincture, and the behaviors of nearly every key villager. Yet the identity of the culprit remained just out of reach. It was time, she decided, to conduct a subtle test. Her opportunity arose when Mrs. Whittaker, pale and nervously composed, called to ask if she might visit for tea. Miss Marple agreed, knowing that the seemingly innocent social visit would provide her with ample opportunity to observe the lady's reactions under gentle pressure. Mrs. Whittaker arrived promptly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes bright yet careful. She seemed relieved to be in a familiar, safe space, free from the prying eyes of neighbors and the relentless judgment of gossip. "Do sit, my dear," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "I thought we might discuss the village gardens. It is remarkable how much everyone enjoys tending to flowers, isn't it? Even Mr. Bartlett took such pride in Havisham's borders." Mrs. Whittaker's lips tightened, and Miss Marple noticed the slight twitch in her fingers as she accepted the cup. The observant mind, she reflected, could read far more from subtle tension than from words alone. "I suppose he did enjoy his gardens," Mrs. Whittaker replied softly, "though I confess I never fully understood his methods. He had such a way with people, didn't he?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Indeed, some men and some women have a remarkable talent for influencing others, sometimes to unintended consequences." A flicker of unease passed over Mrs. Whittaker's expression. Miss Marple continued casually, "It is fascinating how small details can carry great significance. Take foxgloves, for example. Quite beautiful, yet potent if used improperly. One must always respect their power." Mrs. Whittaker's hand tightened around her teacup. "Oh, yes. Dangerous if mishandled," she murmured. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, benign smile. "And yet some people are compelled to experiment, aren't they? Curious about effects they do not fully understand. One can see this in horticulture, in chemistry, and indeed in human behavior." The young woman shifted slightly, her composure slipping in the subtlest manner. A bead of sweat formed at her temple, unnoticed by anyone else, but caught instantly by Miss Marple's keen eyes. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, leaning forward as though sharing an idle observation, "people act in a moment of desperation, believing that their actions will go unnoticed. But the smallest detail, a fingerprint on a paper, a powder on a flower, can betray them. Do you not agree?" Mrs. Whittaker's fingers twitched again, brushing against the tablecloth as if to steady herself. She gave a small, involuntary sigh, and Miss Marple noted how the color drained slightly from her cheeks. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "I never meant for anything like that to happen. I just wanted to—" Her words trailed into a quivering pause, incomplete but telling. Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding, as though listening to the weather rather than a confession. "Yes, dear, sometimes our intentions, however innocent in thought, can lead to consequences we did not foresee. One must always consider carefully before taking action, and yet, of course, the world seldom allows us a second chance." The young woman looked away, eyes glistening. Miss Marple's quiet, unassuming gaze did not press further. She simply observed, waiting for the faintest indication of guilt or discomfort to reveal more than any interrogative question could. In that moment, Miss Marple's mind traced connections she had only hinted at until now. The urgency of the note, the meticulous preparation of the digitalis, the hidden manipulation of the foxgloves, and finally, the subtle, almost involuntary reactions of the woman before her. As Mrs. Whittaker rose to leave, Miss Marple's voice was soft, conversational, yet edged with unspoken insight. "Remember, dear, the truth has a way of presenting itself even when we least expect it. One cannot hide forever from what has been set in motion." The visitor nodded, still pale, and hurried away, her departure hurried but composed. Miss Marple watched her disappear down the lane, knitting resting in her lap, eyes thoughtful. The test had worked. the tiny reactions, the inconsistencies in demeanor, the unintentional confessions of body language. These were the markers she relied upon. By the time dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had formed a clear picture in her mind. The identity of the person responsible for Mr. Bartlett's death was no longer a mystery. Every subtle action, every carefully concealed gesture, every overlooked clue had converged to reveal the truth. And now, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, all that remained was to bring the final revelation into the open. Gently, deliberately, and with that unassuming precision for which she was quietly renowned. The morning sun cast a soft glow over St. Mary Mead, illuminating the village streets with a gentle warmth. Yet beneath this calm exterior, the tension of the past week lingered. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly among the familiar cottages and shops, her keen eyes noting the subtle signs of unease, the hurried steps of a baker delivering bread, the lowered gaze of neighbors passing one another, the slight tremor in a child's hand as she carried a basket of apples. All these small details contributed to the invisible web of truth she'd been steadily unraveling. It was at Havisham House that the final stage of her plan would unfold. Miss Marple had requested the presence of several villagers under the guise of a tea gathering to discuss charitable arrangements, an event ordinary enough not to raise suspicion, yet perfectly suited to reveal hidden truths. One by one the guests arrived, their polite greetings masking apprehension, their eyes flickering with curiosity and caution. When Mrs. Whittaker entered, she was pale, her composure slightly forced. George Latham lingered near the doorway, his shoulders tense, while Miss Hargreaves and Dr. Whittaker took their seats with courteous restraint. Miss Marple moved among them, her gentle smile inviting confidence while concealing her true purpose. "Thank you all for joining me," she said in her soft, deliberate tone. "I thought it might be pleasant to discuss our village gardens. After all, tending to flowers can reveal much about patience, attention, and character." She allowed her gaze to linger on Mrs. Whittaker for just a moment longer than politeness demanded, then continued, "And yet one must always be aware that small, seemingly insignificant details can hold great importance. A bent stem, a fingerprint, a hidden note. Such things may appear trivial, yet they tell stories that words alone cannot." The room fell silent. Mrs. Whittaker's fingers clutched her teacup, knuckles pale. Miss Marple's eyes, unobtrusive yet penetrating, watched her every movement. The others shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of observation. "I've spent the past days reflecting," Miss Marple continued, "on the events of the picnic, on the tragic loss of Mr. Bartlett. It was a day that began with laughter and camaraderie, but ended in sorrow. Yet the truth of what occurred is not found in gossip or assumption, but in careful observation and understanding of human behavior." She paused, allowing the words to settle, then drew from her pocket the small scrap of paper she had discovered beneath the rose bush. "I found this hidden note, written in haste but with deliberate intent. It instructed certain actions that unfortunately led to fatal consequences." All eyes turned to the note, their owners uneasy. Miss Marple set it gently on the table. And then there was the foxglove patch, disturbed and marked with a powdery residue, and the digitalist tincture used with knowledge and care. These were not the acts of a momentary impulse, but of someone familiar with both the estate and Mr. Bartlett's routines. She let her words hang, the silence amplifying their meaning. The person responsible believed their actions would remain unnoticed. They underestimated the power of small signs, the quiet testimony of human nature, and yet all of their careful concealment could not withstand a little attention to subtle behavior. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes meeting Mrs. Whittaker's. "You, Pamela, were at the lemonade tent. You handled the foxgloves. You sent the note. The urgency and secrecy of your actions revealed not malice alone, but fear and desperation. fear of humiliation, and desperation to preserve what you thought was rightfully protected. Mrs. Whittaker's composure shattered. Her lips quivered and tears welled in her eyes. Yes, it was me. I only intended to frighten him, to teach him, to stop his manipulations. I did not mean. I never imagined it would. Oh, Miss Marple. Miss Marple nodded gently, her voice calm and unjudging. Intentions, however sincere in thought, can lead to outcomes no one desires. The human heart is a labyrinth, and sometimes the path we take in the shadows leads to consequences we cannot foresee. George Latham exhaled, relief evident, while Miss Hargreaves and Dr. Whittaker exchanged glances of astonishment and concern. Even the vicar's wife, present as a silent witness, seemed shaken by the revelation. The truth, Miss Marple continued, is rarely dramatic in appearance. It is found in the details, in hesitation, in subtle gestures, in minor inconsistencies. All of these combined led me to understand what had occurred and who had been responsible. Mrs. Whittaker buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Miss Marple, unobtrusive yet vigilant, allowed her a moment, understanding the weight of revelation and remorse. Then, with her characteristic composure, she concluded, "Let this be a lesson to us all. The human heart is capable of both kindness and error. It is our duty to observe carefully, to act wisely, and to remember that appearances are often deceptive." As the villagers departed, subdued yet relieved that the mystery had been resolved, Miss Marple remained seated by the table, her knitting resting in her lap. Outside, the village began to stir again, its familiar rhythms slowly returning. But beneath the surface, an understanding lingered. The quiet, subtle truths of human nature could never be entirely hidden, and justice, in its own gentle way, had been served. Miss Marple gazed out of the window, the soft light of late afternoon reflecting on her calm features. She thought of Mr. Bartlett, of the intricate web of motives, and of the small, telling details that had revealed the heart of the tragedy. In St. Mary Mead, life would continue, yet the echoes of that fateful picnic would remain, a silent reminder of the careful attention required to truly know the people around us. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had returned to its familiar rhythm. The streets were once again filled with the gentle bustle of daily life. The baker's cart rattled over cobblestones. Children chased one another with unrestrained laughter. The hum of gossip resumed its customary cadence. Yet, beneath the surface, the memory of the tragedy at the picnic lingered, like a shadow at the edge of the sunlit village. Miss Marple moved quietly among the streets, noting the subtle shifts in demeanor. George Latham's shoulders were no longer tense. There was a cautious relief in his step as he greeted neighbors. Mrs. Whittaker had returned home, still pale, still subdued, yet walking with a careful dignity that suggested both remorse and an unspoken hope for forgiveness. The villagers themselves carried an air of tentative restoration, their curiosity tempered by the awareness that the truth, however unsettling, had been brought to light. Miss Marple paused by the market, observing the interplay of people. She noticed how Mrs. Hartnell lingered at the fruit stall, her usual gossiping tongue quieter, tempered by the recent revelation. Even Miss Hargreaves, typically composed, exhibited a new layer of humility in her interactions, a recognition that appearances could mislead, and that human motives were often far more complex than assumed. In the quiet of her cottage later that morning, Miss Marple reflected on the events of the past days. She had observed the subtle signals that betrayed truth, the small, almost imperceptible gestures that revealed intentions, and the manner in which people concealed, rationalized, and justified their actions. To an ordinary eye, the mystery might have seemed solvable by the simplest suspicion, yet human behavior, in its richness and subtlety, demanded careful attention. As she arranged her knitting beside the fire, She considered Mrs. Whittaker's motives once more. Fear, jealousy, and desperation had combined in a moment of misjudgment. It was a tragedy born not of malice alone, but of misunderstanding and the human tendency to act impulsively when emotions overwhelm reason. Miss Marple understood, with her characteristic compassion, that culpability did not erase the humanity of the person involved. The village, too, had been touched by a subtle shift. Conversations were quieter, more reflective. The villagers had learned, perhaps unconsciously, the weight of hidden motives and unspoken resentments. In polite smiles and measured words, one could sense a shared understanding. Life in St. Mary Mead would continue, but with the knowledge that human hearts often contained complexities unseen at first glance. Miss Marple, wandering later through the gardens of her cottage, found herself examining the foxgloves. Their bell-shaped flowers still nodded gently in the breeze, reminders of the incident that had set the village in turmoil. She ran her fingers over the stems, recalling the powdery residue and the care with which it had been handled. Nature, in its quiet constancy, seemed to offer a measure of comfort, a counterpoint to the frailty of human intentions. She thought, too, of Mr. Bartlett, whose charm and manipulations had been both his strength and his downfall. He had set in motion events that revealed the hidden tensions of St. Mary Mead, yet he had also allowed the villagers to see themselves in unflinching honesty. In the interplay of human desires and misjudgments, lessons had been learned, small yet enduring, about vigilance, compassion, and the consequences of action. As dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple prepared a modest supper and settled by the window, her knitting in hand. The village was bathed in the soft amber glow of fading light, the air carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. She observed the quiet streets, the subtle movements of neighbors, and the gentle rhythm of lives resuming their ordinary course. Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the constancy of human nature, the interplay of curiosity, fear, hope, and error. Life in St. Mary Mead would continue, unchanged in its surface appearance, yet enriched with a deeper awareness. The village had witnessed both tragedy and revelation, and in the calm aftermath, it had learned, in its small way, the value of careful observation and understanding. With a small, contented smile, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the last light of day into the quiet night. And she, ever watchful, understood that while the storms of human emotion would arise again, the subtle truths of character and conscience would always be revealed in their own time. The night had settled gently over St. Mary Mead, and the village lay quiet beneath a blanket of stars. Windows glowed warmly, chimneys exhaled thin curls of smoke, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, as if marking the ordinary peace that had returned. Miss Marple, sitting in her favorite armchair by the fire, reflected on the events that had unfolded over the past fortnight. The picnic, which had begun as a joyful celebration of community, had revealed the hidden currents of the village: envy, pride, fear, and concealed resentments, each layer of human behavior intricately intertwined. Mr. Bartlett's death had been a tragedy, yet it had also served as a mirror reflecting the complexity of hearts and minds that Miss Marple had observed with quiet patience. She picked up her knitting, the rhythmic click of needles a soothing counterpoint to the chaos of human emotion she had witnessed. Each stitch reminded her that life was composed of countless small actions, many unnoticed, each carrying potential consequence. Human nature, she thought, was much like her knitting, intricate, interwoven, and full of subtle patterns that only a careful eye could discern. The village had returned to its familiar routines, yet a gentle awareness lingered. George Latham no longer walked with the shadow of suspicion across his shoulders. Mrs. Whittaker, though burdened by remorse, carried herself with a new humility, and even those who had been merely observers of the drama had been subtly changed. Polite conversation now contained a hint of caution, an understanding that appearances were often deceptive and that small details could hold profound significance. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the concept of justice, not as a formal pronouncement of guilt, but as a balance restored by the clarity of understanding. The culprit had been revealed not through force or accusation, but through patience, observation, and careful interpretation of subtle cues. It was a reminder, she mused, that truth often emerged quietly in ways that respected the dignity of all involved. She thought of the village gardens, still bright with autumn blooms. The foxgloves, once disturbed in a moment of desperation, now stood upright, their flowers catching the moonlight. Even in nature, Miss Marple reflected, one could find lessons of resilience and renewal. The human heart, though susceptible to error, also had the capacity for reflection, remorse, and reconciliation. The small village had also demonstrated another truth, that community was sustained not by perfection, but by vigilance, kindness, and understanding. Each resident, in their own way, had been drawn into a web of motives and reactions, and each had emerged with a clearer comprehension of themselves and one another. Even the youngest children, who had observed the unfolding events with wide eyes, carried the subtle imprint of experience, a reminder that human nature is learned as much as it is inherited. Miss Marple, settling deeper into her chair, considered the delicate balance between action and consequence. A single moment of fear or misjudgment had led to tragedy, yet patience, quiet observation, and empathy had restored clarity. The events of the picnic were now part of the village's shared memory, a story to be remembered and learned from, not merely recounted. In the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The village was safe, the mystery resolved, and the lesson clear. Human nature was endlessly complex, often contradictory, but ultimately understandable to those who watched, listened, and reflected. She looked once more out the window, where the silver moonlight shimmered across the streets of St. Mary Mead. Somewhere beneath its glow, the villagers slept, unaware of the careful scrutiny and gentle wisdom that had guided the truth into the light. And Miss Marple, content and composed, understood that life would continue, with its hidden motives and subtle deceptions, yet always open to the discerning eye of those willing to observe with patience and compassion. The fire crackled softly, the night held its breath, and Miss Marple, ever vigilant yet serene, allowed herself a final sip of tea. In the stillness, she knew that the village, and indeed humanity itself, would endure, flawed, intricate, and endlessly fascinating. With the events of the picnic fully resolved and Mrs. Whittaker having confessed, St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its quiet, gentle rhythm. The village's streets were once again filled with children's laughter. Neighbors exchanged courteous greetings without suspicion, and even the gossiping tongues of Mrs. Hartnell and Mrs. Weatherby carried a softer tone. The community, though shaken, had emerged wiser, reminded that beneath the surface of polite smiles and cordial manners, human emotions could be unpredictable, intricate, and sometimes dangerous. Miss Marple, ever observant yet unassuming, remained the calm center of this restored order. Her quiet vigilance had uncovered the hidden motives, subtle clues, and unintended consequences that others had overlooked. She had relied not on dramatic interrogations or scientific evidence, but on a patient understanding of human nature, the small gestures, fleeting expressions, and inconsistencies that spoke louder than words ever could. The village had learned that justice could be both gentle and firm. While wrongdoing had been exposed, Miss Marple's measured approach allowed the guilty to face the truth without humiliation or spectacle. In her reflections, she recognized the delicate balance between compassion and accountability, a lesson she hoped the villagers would carry forward. In the stillness of her cottage that evening, Miss Marple looked out upon St. Mary Mead bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The foxgloves in her garden nodded gently in the breeze, a quiet symbol of both fragility and resilience. She mused on the intricate weave of human motives and the enduring need for observation, empathy, and understanding. Life in St. Mary Mead would continue, with its ordinary routines and occasional surprises, yet beneath the calm exterior, the subtle truths of character and conscience would quietly endure. And as always, Miss Marple would be there, patient, perceptive, and quietly guiding the village toward clarity whenever the hidden shadows of human nature threatened to rise again.